Package org.paros proxy.paros.core.spider. Import java.utility vector. Import java.utility regex.matcher. Import java.utility regex.pattern. Public class meta extends org.paros proxy.paros.core.spider.tag. Parser for meta tag. Private static final parser tag parser equals new parser tag, meta, parser tag dot closing underscore tag underscore optional. Parser for content attribute in tag. Private static final parser iter parse rater content equals new parser iter dot content. Private static final pattern URL pattern equals pattern dot compile, URL \\s equals \s, plus, pattern dot case underscore insensitive. Private string URL equals. Get an array of A tags. At param doc. The HTML document to be parsed. At return array of A. Public static meta get metas, string doc. Vector metas equals new vector. Parser dot parse, doc. While, parser dot next tag. String content equals parser dot get content. String address equals parser dot get address. Meta m equals new meta. M dot build address, address. M dot build, content. Metas dot add element, m. Meta result equals new meta metas dot size. Result equals, meta, metas dot to array, result. Return result. Protected void build address, string address. Super dot build address, address. Try. String s equals parse rater content dot get value, address. Matcher equals URL pattern dot matcher, s. If, matcher dot find. URL equals matcher dot group, 1. Catch, exception e. At return returns the ref. Public string get URL. Return URL. Package org.paros proxy.paros.model. Import java.io.file. Import java.io.file name filter. Import java.io.io exception. Import org.paros proxy.paros.constant. Import org.paros proxy.paros.db.database. Import org.xml.sax exception. To change the template for this generated type comment, go to Window, Preferences, Java, Code Generation, Code and Comments. Public class model. Private static model equals null. Private static final string name underscore template equals constant dot name underscore template. Private static final string name underscore untitled equals constant dot name underscore untitled. Private string name underscore untitled equals constant dot get instance dot name underscore untitled. Private static int name underscore copy equals 1. Private session equals null. Private options param equals null. Private database db equals null. Private string current name untitled equals. Public model. Make sure the variable here will not refer back to model itself. Do it in init or respective getter. Session equals new session, this. Options param equals new options param. At return returns the options param. Public options param get options param. If, options param equals null. Options param equals new options param. Return options param. At param options param the options param to set. Public void set options param. Options param. Options param equals param. At return returns the session. Public session gets as Zion. If, session equals null. Session equals new session, this. Return session. At param session the session to set. Public void sets as Zion, session param session. Session equals param session. Public void init, throws SAX exception, IO exception, exception. DB equals database.getSingleton. Create and open untitled. History reference .settable history, get DB, .gettable history. Get options param, .load, constant .file underscore config. Get options param, .load, constant .get instance, .file underscore config. Public static model getSingleton. If model equals null. Model equals new model. Return model. At return returns the DB. Public database get DB. Return DB. Public void movesession string dest file, throws exception. Always use copy session because moving file does not work in Debian. And for Windows renaming file acrossing different drives does not work. Copy session current name untitled, dest file. Get DB, close. Boolean result equals false. File in1 equals new file, current name untitled plus data. File in2 equals new file, current name untitled plus script. File in3 equals new file, current name untitled plus properties. File in4 equals new file, current name untitled plus backup. File out1 equals new file, dest file plus data. File out2 equals new file, dest file plus script. File out3 equals new file, dest file plus properties. File out4 equals new file, dest file plus backup. If file out1 exists, file out1 delete. If file out2 exists, file out2 delete. If file out3 exists, file out3 delete. If file out4 exists, file out4 delete. Result equals file in1 renamito, file out1. Result equals file in2 renamito, file out2. Result equals file in3 renamito, file out3. If file in4 exists. Result equals file in4 renamito, file out4. Get DB, open, dest file. Public void copy session, string current file, string dest file, throws exception. Get DB, close, false. Copy session related files to the path specified. File copier equals new file copier. File in1 equals new file, current file plus data. File out1 equals new file, dest file plus data. Copier copy, file in1, file out1. File in2 equals new file, current file plus script. File out2 equals new file, dest file plus script. Copier copy, file in2, file out2. File in3 equals new file, current file plus properties. File out3 equals new file, dest file plus properties. Copier copy, file in3, file out3. File in4 equals new file, current file plus backup. If file in4 exists. File out4 equals new file, dest file plus backup. Copier copy, file in4, file out4. Get DB, open, dest file. Public void create and open untitled, throws class not found exception, exception. Get DB, close, false. Delete all untitled session DB in session directory. File dir equals new file, get session folder. File list file equals dir list files, new file name filter. Public boolean accept, file dir1, string file name. If file name starts with untitled. Return true. Return false. For int I equals 0, I list file length, I++. List file I delete. Copy and create new template DB. Current name untitled equals name underscore untitled plus name underscore copy. File copier copier equals new file copier. File in equals new file, name underscore template plus dot data. File out equals new file, current name untitled plus dot data. File out dot delete. Copier dot copy, file in, file out. File in equals new file, name underscore template plus dot properties. File out equals new file, current name untitled plus dot properties. File out dot delete. Copier dot copy, file in, file out. File in equals new file, name underscore template plus dot script. File out equals new file, current name untitled plus dot script. File out dot delete. Copier dot copy, file in, file out. File in equals new file, current name untitled plus dot backup. If file in dot exists. File in dot delete. Get db dot open, current name untitled. Name underscore copy plus plus. Package org.paros proxy.paros.core.scanner. To change the template for this generated type comment, go to Window, Preferences, Java, Code Generation, Code and Comments. Class name value pair. Private string name equals null. Private string value equals null. Private int position equals 0. Name value pair. @param name. @param value. Name value pair, string name, string value, int position. Super. This dot name equals name. This dot value equals value. This dot position equals position. @return returns the name. Public string get name. Return name. @param name the name to set. Public void set name, string name. This dot name equals name. @return returns the value. Public string get value. Return value. @param value the value to set. Public void set value, string value. This dot value equals value. @return returns the position. Public int get position. Return position. @param position the position to set. Public void set position, int position. This dot position equals position. Package org.paros proxy.paros.core.spider. Import java.utility vector. Public class option extends tag. Private static final parser tag parser equals new parser tag, tag.option, parser tag.closing underscore tag underscore optional. Private string value equals static option get options, string doc. Vector options equals new vector. Parser.parse, doc. While, parser.next tag. String content equals parser.get content. String address equals parser.get address. Option equals new option. Option.build address, address. Option.build, content. Options.add element, option. Option result equals new option options.size. Result equals, option, options.toArray, result. Return result. Protected void build address, string address. Option does not have name attribute. Super.build address, address. Value equals parse rater value.get value, address. Protected void build, string content. If there is no value attribute, the value is the content. If value.trim.length equals 0. Value equals content. @return returns the value. Public string get value. Return value. Package org.paros proxy.paros.extension.option. Import java.awt.gridbag constraints. Import java.awt.gridbag layout. Import javax.swing.jlabel. Import javax.swing.jscrollpane. Import javax.swing.jtable. Import javax.swing.table.tablecolumn. Import org.paros proxy.paros.model.options.param. Import org.paros proxy.paros.network.connection.param. Import org.paros proxy.paros.view.abstract.param panel. Import org.paros proxy.paros.view.options authentication table model. To change the template for this generated type comment, go to Window, Preferences, Java, Code Generation, Code and Comments. Public Class Options Authentication Panel extends Abstract Param panel. Private JTable table auth equals null. Private JScrollpane equals null. Private Options Authentication Table Model auth model equals null. At javdicl index equals 0 parse visual constraint equals 110,314. Public Options Authentication Panel. Super. Initialize. This method initializes this. At return void. Private void initialize. Java.awt.gridbag constraints gridbag constraints 2 equals new gridbag constraints. Java.awt.gridbag constraints gridbag constraints 1 equals new gridbag constraints. javax.swing.jlabel jlabel equals new jlabel. This dot set layout, new gridbag layout. This dot set size, 409, 268. This dot set name, authentication. Jlabel.set text, HTML body p. Enter the HTTP authentication of Vario IS hosts into the table below. PP currently basic authentication is supported. NTLM support works in some hosts but not extensively tested. PP to delete an entry, just leave the host name blank. P body HTML. Jlabel.set preferred size, new java.awt.dimension, 494,80. Jlabel.set minimum size, new java.awt.dimension, 494,16. Gridbag constraints 1.gridx equals 0. Gridbag constraints 1.grid equals 0. Gridbag constraints 1.grid height equals 1. Gridbag constraints 1.ipad equals 65. Gridbag constraints 1.insets equals new java.awt.insets, 10,0,5,0. Gridbag constraints 1.anchor equals java.awt.gridbag constraints.northwest. Gridbag constraints 1.fill equals java.awt.gridbag constraints.horizontal. Gridbag constraints 1.weights equals 1.0d. Gridbag constraints 2.gridx equals 0. Gridbag constraints 2.grid equals 1. Gridbag constraints 2.weights equals 1.0. Gridbag constraints 2.weight equals 1.0. Gridbag constraints 2.fill equals java.awt.gridbag constraints.both. Gridbag constraints 2.ipadx equals 0. Gridbag constraints 2.insets equals new java.awt.insets, 0,0,0,0. Gridbag constraints 2.anchor equals java.awt.gridbag constraints.northwest. This dot add, jlabel, gridbag constraints 1. This dot add, get jscrollpane, gridbag constraints 2. Non-javadoc. At ccom proof secure.paros.view.abstract param panel number init param, java.lang.object. Public void init param, object obj. Options param equals, options param, obj. Connection param equals options param dot get connection param. Get tot model, dot set list auth, connection param dot get list auth. Non-javadoc. At ccom proof secure.paros.view.abstract param panel number validate param, java.lang.object. Public void validate param, object obj, throws exception. Non-javadoc. At ccom proof secure.paros.view.abstract param panel number save param, java.lang.object. Public void save param, object obj, throws exception. Options param equals, options param, obj. Connection param equals options param.get connection param. Connection param.set listauth, get auth model, .get listauth. Private static int width equals 280, 55, 100, 100, 70. This method initializes table auth. At return javax.swing.jtable. Private jtable gettable auth. If table auth equals null. Table auth equals new jtable. Table auth.set model, get auth model. Table auth.stro height, 18. Table auth.set intercell spacing, new java.awt.dimension, 1, 1. 4. Int I equals 0, I5, I++. Table column equals table auth.get column model, .get column, I. Column.set preferred width, width I. Return table auth. This method initializes jscrollPane. At return javax.swing.jscrollPane. Private jscrollPane get jscrollPane. If jscrollPane equals null. JScrollPane equals new JScrollPane. JScrollPane.set viewport view, gettable auth. JScrollPane.set border, javax.swing.border factory.create border, javax.swing.border.etched border.raised. Return JScrollPane. This method initializes auth model. At return com proof secure.paros.view.options authentication table model. Private options authentication table model get auth model. If auth model equals null. Auth model equals new options authentication table model. Return auth model. At javdecl index equals 0 visual constraint equals 10, 10. Package org.parosproxy.paros.view. Import java.utility vector. Import javax.swing.table.abstract table model. Import org.parosproxy.paros.network.host authentication. To change the template for this generated type comment, go to Window, Preferences, Java, Code Generation, Code and Comments. Public class options authentication table model extends abstract table model. Private static final string column names equals host, port, username, password, realm. Private vector list auth equals new vector. Public options authentication table model. Super. Non-javadoc. At cjavax.swing.table model number get column count. Public int get column count. Return 5. Non-javadoc. At cjavax.swing.table model number getRow count. Public int getRow count. Return list auth.size. Non-javadoc. At cjavax.swing.table model number get value at, int. Public object get value at, int row, int col. Host authentication auth equals, host authentication, list auth.get, row. Object result equals null. Switch, col. Case 0, result equals auth.getHost name. Break. Case 1, result equals new integer, auth.getPort. Break. Case 2, result equals auth.getUsername. Break. Case 3, result equals auth.getPassword. Break. Case 4, result equals auth.getRealm. Break. Default, result equals. Return result. Public boolean is editable, int row index, int column index. Return true. Public void set value at, object value, int row, int col. Host authentication auth equals, host authentication, list auth.get, row. Object result equals null. Switch, col. Case 0, auth.thost name, string, value. Break. Case 1, auth.setPort, integer, value, .int value. Break. Case 2, auth.setUsername, string, value. Break. Case 3, auth.setPassword, string, value. Break. Case 4, auth.setRealm, string, value. Break. Check independent row. Fire double cell updated, row, col. At return returns the list auth. Public vector get list auth. Host authentication auth equals null. 4, int I equals 0, I list auth.size. Auth equals, host authentication, list auth.get, I. If, auth.getHost name, dot equals. List auth.remove, I. Continue. I++. Vector new list equals new vector, list auth. Return new list. At param list auth the list auth to set. Public void set list auth, vector list auth. This dot list auth equals new vector, list auth. Check independent row. Fire double data changed. Public string get column name, in col. Return column name col. Private void check independent row. Host authentication auth equals null. If, list auth.size, 0. Auth equals, host authentication, list auth.get, list auth.size, 1. If, auth.getHost name, dot equals. Auth equals new host authentication. List auth.add, auth. Else. Auth equals new host authentication. List auth.add, auth. Public class get column class, int C. If, C equals 1. Return integer dot class. Return string dot class. Package org.paros proxy.paros.extension.option. Import java.awt.card layout. Import java.awt.gridbag constraints. Import java.awt.gridbag layout. Import java.io.file. Import javax.swing.jbutton. Import javax.swing.j checkbox. Import javax.swing.j dialog. Import javax.swing.j file cursor. Import javax.swing.j label. Import javax.swing.joption pane. Import javax.swing.j panel. Import javax.swing.j password field. Import javax.swing.j text field. Import org.paros proxy.paros.model.model. Import org.paros proxy.paros.model.options param. Import org.paros proxy.paros.view.abstract param panel. Import org.paros proxy.paros.view.view. To change the template for this generated type comment, go to Window, Preferences, Java, Code Generation, Code and Comments. Public Class Options Certificate Panel extends Abstract param panel. Private jpanel panel certificate equals null, at javdecl index equals 0 visual constraint equals 520,10. Private j checkbox xqs client certificate equals null. Public options certificate panel. Super. Initialize. Private static final string root equals. Private jpanel panel location equals null. Private jlabel lbl location equals null. Private jtext field text location equals null. Private jbutton btn location equals null. Private jlabel 1 equals null. Private jlabel equals null. This method initializes this. At return void. Private void initialize. This dot set layout, new card layout. This dot set name, certificate. This .add, get panel certificate, get panel certificate, .get name. This method initializes panel certificate. At return javax.swing.jpanel. Private jpanel get panel certificate. If panel certificate equals null. JLabel equals new JLabel. Grid bag constraints 11 equals new grid bag constraints. JLabel 1 equals new JLabel. Grid bag constraints 6 equals new grid bag constraints. Grid bag constraints 2 equals new grid bag constraints. Grid bag constraints 1 equals new grid bag constraints. Panel certificate equals new jpanel. Panel certificate.set layout, new grid bag layout. Panel certificate.set size, 114, 132. Panel certificate.set name, certificate. Panel certificate.set font, new java.awt.font, dialog, java.awt.font.plain, 11. Grid bag constraints 1.gridx equals 0. Grid bag constraints 1.grid equals 1. Grid bag constraints 1.insets equals new java.awt.insets, 2,2,2,2. Grid bag constraints 1.anchor equals java.awt.gridbagconstraints.northwest. Grid bag constraints 1.fill equals java.awt.gridbagconstraints.horizontal. Grid bag constraints 2.gridx equals 0. Grid bag constraints 2.grid equals 2. Grid bag constraints 2.ipadx equals 113. Grid bag constraints 2.ipad equals 15. Grid bag constraints 2.gridwidth equals 2. Grid bag constraints 2.gridheight equals 2. Grid bag constraints 2.anchor equals java.awt.gridbagconstraints.northwest. Grid bag constraints 2.fill equals java.awt.gridbagconstraints.horizontal. JLabel 1.set text. Grid bag constraints 6.anchor equals java.awt.gridbagconstraints.northwest. Grid bag constraints 6.fill equals java.awt.gridbagconstraints.both. Grid bag constraints 6.gridx equals 0. Grid bag constraints 6.grid equals 5. Grid bag constraints 6.weights equals 1.0d. Grid bag constraints 6.weighty equals 1.0d. JLabel.set text, HTML body p select client certificate file, PKCS number 12. You will be prompted for the passphrase after the certificate file is selected. The PKCS number 12 file should be exported from browsers. PP certificate setting will not be stored in options and you will need to enable certificate next time you restart paros p body HTML. Grid bag constraints 11.gridx equals 0. Grid bag constraints 11.grid equals 0. Grid bag constraints 11.weights equals 1.0d. Grid bag constraints 11.fill equals java.awt.gridbagconstraints.horizontal. Grid bag constraints 11.insets equals new java.awt.insets, 5,0,5,0. Panel certificate.add, JLabel, grid bag constraints 11. Panel certificate.add, getchkc client certificate, grid bag constraints 1. Panel certificate.add, get pane allocation, grid bag constraints 2. Panel certificate.add, JLabel 1, grid bag constraints 6. Return panel certificate. This method initializes SQS client certificate. At return javax.swing.j checkbox. Private j checkbox getchkc client certificate. If SQS client certificate equals null. SQS client certificate equals new j checkbox. SQS client certificate.set text, use client certificate. SQS client certificate.set vertical alignment, javax.swing.swingConstants.top. SQS client certificate.set vertical text position, javax.swing.swingConstants.top. SQS client certificate.addItem listener, new java.awt.event.item listener. Public void item state changed, java.awt.event.item event e. Get pane allocation, .set enabled, xQs client certificate .is selected. Gets location, .set enabled, xQs client certificate .is selected. Get ton location, .set enabled, xQs client certificate .is selected. If xQs client certificate .is selected. Get ton location, .do click. Return xQs client certificate. Public void init param, object obj. Options param options equals, options param, obj. Getchkc client certificate, .sets elected, options.get certificate param, .isc client cert. Get ton location, .set enabled, getchkc client certificate, .is selected. Gets location, .set text, options.get certificate param, .get client cert location. Public void validate param, object obj. No validation needed. Public void save param, object obj, throws exception. Options param options equals, options param, obj. Options param certificate cert param equals options.get certificate param. Cert param.c2c client cert, getchkc client certificate, is selected. Cert param.set enable certificate, cert param.isc client cert. This method initializes panel location. At return javax.swing.jpanel. Private jpanel get pane allocation. If panel location equals null. LBL location equals new JLabel. Grid bag constraints 3 equals new grid bag constraints. Grid bag constraints 4 equals new grid bag constraints. Grid bag constraints 5 equals new grid bag constraints. Panel location equals new JPanel. Panel location .set layout, new grid bag layout. LBL location .set text, location. Grid bag constraints 3.gridx equals 0. Grid bag constraints 3.grid equals 0. Grid bag constraints 3.insets equals new java.awt.insets, 2,2,2,2. Grid bag constraints 3.anchor equals java.awt.gridbagconstraints.northwest. Grid bag constraints 4.gridx equals 1. Grid bag constraints 4.grid equals 0. Grid bag constraints 4.weights equals 1.0. Grid bag constraints 4.fill equals java.awt.gridbagconstraints.horizontal. Grid bag constraints 4.insets equals new java.awt.insets, 2,2,2,2. Grid bag constraints 4.anchor equals java.awt.gridbagconstraints.northwest. Grid bag constraints 5.gridx equals 2. Grid bag constraints 5.grid equals 0. Grid bag constraints 5.insets equals new java.awt.insets, 2,2,2,2. Grid bag constraints 5.anchor equals java.awt.gridbagconstraints.northwest. Grid bag constraints 5.gridHeight equals 0. Grid bag constraints 5.gridWidth equals 0. Panel location.set border, javax.swing.border factory.create_a_titled null, client certificate, javax.swing.border.titledborder.default_justification, javax.swing.border.titledborder.default_position, null, null. Panel location.add, LBL location, grid bag constraints 3. Panel location.add, gets location, grid bag constraints 4. Panel location.add, get ton location, grid bag constraints 5. Return panel location. This method initializes text location. At return javax.swing.jText field. Private jText field gets location. If text location equals null. Text location equals new jText field. Text location.set editable, false. Return text location. This method initializes btn location. At return javax.swing.jButton. Private jButton get ton location. If btn location equals null. btn location equals new J button. btn location dot set text. btn location dot set preferred size, new java dot awt dot dimension, 25,25. btn location dot add action listener, new java dot awt dot event dot action listener. Public void action performed, java dot awt dot event dot action event e. J file cursor chooser equals null. If gets location dot get text equals null and gets location dot get text dot length greater than 0. File equals new file gets location dot get text chooser equals new J file cursor file. Else chooser equals new J file cursor. Options param certificate cert param equals model dot get singleton dot get options param dot get certificate param. Int rc equals chooser dot show append dialog view dot get singleton dot get mainframe. If rc equals J file cursor dot approve underscore option. Try file key file equals chooser dot get selected file. If key file equals null. Return J password field pwd equals new J password field. String label equals please input passphrase for the PKCS number 12 certificate. Object array equals label pwd. Joption pane equals new joption pane array joption pane dot question underscore message joption pane dot ok underscore cancel underscore option. J dialog equals pane dot create dialog view dot get singleton dot get mainframe passphrase. Dialog dot set visible true. Int result equals integer pane dot get value dot int value. If result equals joption pane dot ok underscore option. Return char passphrase equals pwd dot get password. If passphrase equals null. Return cert param dot c2c client cert true. Cert param dot set client cert location key file dot get absolute path. Cert param dot set certificate passphrase. Clean up passphrase asap. 4 int I equals 0 I passphrase dot length I plus plus. Passphrase I equals gets location dot set text key file dot get absolute path. Catch exception x. View dot get singleton dot show warning dialog error reading PKCS number 12 certificate. Please use correct passphrase /r/NAND use certificate exported from Mozilla Netscape. Ex print stack trace. Cert param dot c2c client cert false. Cert param dot set client cert location. Return btn location. At javedical index equals 0 visual constraint equals 10,10. Package org.paros proxy.paros.extension. Import org.paros proxy.paros.model.options param. To change the template for this generated type comment, go to Window, Preferences, Java, Code Generation, Code and Comments. Public Interface Options changed Listener. Public Void Option changed, Options param. Package org.paros proxy.paros.extension.option. Import java.awt.card layout. Import java.awt.color. Import java.awt.gridbag constraints. Import java.awt.gridbag layout. Import javax.swing.j checkbox. Import javax.swing.j label. Import javax.swing.j panel. Import javax.swing.j scroll pane. Import javax.swing.j text area. Import javax.swing.j text field. Import org.paros proxy.paros.model.options param. Import org.paros proxy.paros.network.connection param. Import org.paros proxy.paros.view.abstract param panel. To change the template for this generated type comment, go to Window, Preferences, Java, Code Generation, Code and Comments. Public Class Options Connection Panel extends Abstract param panel. Private Static Final String Root equals Private J checkbox xQs proxicane equals null. Private J panel equals null. Private J panel proxy auth equals null. Private J scroll pane equals null. Private options param equals null. Private J panel proxicane equals null. Private J text field text proxicane equals null. Private J text field text proxicane port equals null. Private J text area text proxicane skip name equals null. Private J text field text proxicane realm equals null. Private J text field text proxicane username equals null. Private J text field text proxicane password equals null. Private J checkbox proxicane auth equals null. Public options connection panel. Super. Initialize. This method initializes xQs proxicane. At return javax.swing.j checkbox. Private J checkbox getxqs proxicane. If xQs proxicane equals null. xQs proxicane equals new J checkbox. xQs proxicane.set text. Use an outgoing proxy server. xQs proxicane.add action listener. New java.awt.event.action listener. Public void action performed. java.awt.event.action event e. Set proxicane enabled. xQs proxicane. Is selected. Return xQs proxicane. This method initializes jpanel. At return javax.swing.jpanel. Private jpanel get jpanel. If jpanel equals null. java.awt.gridbag constraints 71 equals new gridbag constraints. java.awt.gridbag constraints 61 equals new gridbag constraints. java.awt.gridbag constraints 51 equals new gridbag constraints. java.awt.gridbag constraints 41 equals new gridbag constraints. java.awt.gridbag constraints 3 equals new gridbag constraints. java.awt.gridbag constraints 2 equals new gridbag constraints. java.awt.gridbag constraints 15 equals new gridbag constraints. javax.swing.jlabel 7 equals new jlabel. javax.swing.jlabel 6 equals new jlabel. javax.swing.jlabel 5 equals new jlabel. jpanel equals new jpanel. jpanel.set layout, new gridbag layout. jlabel5.set text, address domain name. jlabel6.set text, port, e.g. 8080. jlabel7.set text, HTML skip IP address or domain names below, for wildcard characters, names separate by p.html. Gridbag constraints 15.gridx equals 0. Gridbag constraints 15.grid equals 0. Gridbag constraints 15.insets equals new java.awt.insets, 2,2,2,2. Gridbag constraints 15.anchor equals java.awt.gridbagconstraints.northwest. Gridbag constraints 15.fill equals java.awt.gridbagconstraints.horizontal. Gridbag constraints 15.gridwidth equals 2. Gridbag constraints 15.weights equals 1.0d. Gridbag constraints 2.gridx equals 0. Gridbag constraints 2.grid equals 1. Gridbag constraints 2.insets equals new java.awt.insets, 2,2,2,2. Gridbag constraints 2.anchor equals java.awt.gridbag constraints.west. Gridbag constraints 2.fill equals java.awt.gridbag constraints.horizontal. Gridbag constraints 2.weights equals 0.5d. Gridbag constraints 3.gridx equals 1. Gridbag constraints 3.grid equals 1. Gridbag constraints 3.weights equals 0.5d. Gridbag constraints 3.fill equals java.awt.gridbag constraints.horizontal. Gridbag constraints 3.insets equals new java.awt.insets, 2,2,2,2. Gridbag constraints 3.anchor equals java.awt.gridbag constraints.west. Gridbag constraints 3.apadx equals 50. Gridbag constraints 41.gridx equals 0. Gridbag constraints 41.grid equals 2. Gridbag constraints 41.insets equals new java.awt.insets, 2,2,2,2. Gridbag constraints 41.anchor equals java.awt.gridbag constraints.west. Gridbag constraints 41.fill equals java.awt.gridbag constraints.horizontal. Gridbag constraints 41.weights equals 0.5d. Gridbag constraints 51.gridx equals 1. Gridbag constraints 51.grid equals 2. Gridbag constraints 51.weights equals 0.5d. Gridbag constraints 51.fill equals java.awt.gridbag constraints.horizontal. Gridbag constraints 51.insets equals new java.awt.insets, 2,2,2,2. Gridbag constraints 51.anchor equals java.awt.gridbag constraints.west. Gridbag constraints 51.apadx equals 50. Gridbag constraints 61.gridx equals 0. Gridbag constraints 61.grid equals 3. Gridbag constraints 61.insets equals new java.awt.insets, 2,2,2,2. Gridbag constraints 61.fill equals java.awt.gridbag constraints.horizontal. Gridbag constraints 61.weights equals 1.0d. Gridbag constraints 61.gridwidth equals 2. Gridbag constraints 61.anchor equals java.awt.gridbag constraints.northeast. Gridbag constraints 71.gridx equals 0. Gridbag constraints 71.grid equals 4. Gridbag constraints 71.weights equals 1.0d. Gridbag constraints 71.weight equals 0.2d. Gridbag constraints 71.fill equals java.awt.gridbag constraints.horizontal. Gridbag constraints 71.insets equals new java.awt.insets, 2,2,2,2. Gridbag constraints 71.anchor equals java.awt.gridbag constraints.northeast. Gridbag constraints 71.gridwidth equals 2. Gridbag constraints 71.ipad equals 20. jpanel.setBorder, javax.swing.borderFactory.createATitledBorder, null, use proxy chain, javax.swing.border.titledBorder.default_justification, javax.swing.border.titledBorder.default_position, new java.awt.font, dialog, java.awt.font.plain, 11, java.awt.color.black. jpanel.add, getchkisproxicane, gridbag constraints 15. jpanel.add, jlabel 5, gridbag constraints 2. jpanel.add, getstproxicaname, gridbag constraints 3. jpanel.add, jlabel 6, gridbag constraints 41. jpanel.add, getstproxicane port, gridbag constraints 51. jpanel.add, jlabel 7, gridbag constraints 61. jpanel.add, get jscrollpane, gridbag constraints 71. Return jpanel. This method initializes panel proxy auth. At return javax.swing.jpanel. Private jpanel get panel proxy auth. If Panel proxy auth equals null. Java.awt.gridbag constraints gridbag constraints 72 equals new gridbag constraints. Java.awt.gridbag constraints gridbag constraints 62 equals new gridbag constraints. Java.awt.gridbag constraints gridbag constraints 52 equals new gridbag constraints. Java.awt.gridbag constraints gridbag constraints 42 equals new gridbag constraints. Java.awt.gridbag constraints gridbag constraints 31 equals new gridbag constraints. Java.awt.gridbag constraints gridbag constraints 21 equals new gridbag constraints. Java.awt.gridbag constraints gridbag constraints 16 equals new gridbag constraints. Javax.swing.jlabel 11 equals new jlabel. Javax.swing.jlabel 10 equals new jlabel. Javax.swing.jlabel 9 equals new jlabel. Panel proxy auth equals new jpanel. Panel proxy auth.set layout, new gridbag layout. Jlabel 9.set text, realm. Jlabel 10.set text, username. Jlabel 11.set text, password, stored in clear text. Panel proxy auth.set border, javax.swing.border factory.create a tight lead border, null, proxy authentication, javax.swing.border.titled border.default_justification, javax.swing.border.titled border.default_position, new java.awt.font, dialog, java.awt.font.plain, 11, java.awt.color.black. Panel proxy auth.set font, new java.awt.font, dialog, java.awt.font.plain, 11. Gridbag constraints 16.gridx equals 0. Gridbag constraints 16.grid equals 0. Gridbag constraints 16.insets equals new java.awt.insets, 2,2,2,2. Gridbag constraints 16.anchor equals java.awt.gridbag constraints.northwest. Gridbag constraints 16.fill equals java.awt.gridbag constraints.horizontal. Gridbag constraints 16.gridwidth equals 2. Gridbag constraints 16.weights equals 1.0d. Gridbag constraints 21.gridx equals 0. Gridbag constraints 21.grid equals 1. Gridbag constraints 21.insets equals new java.awt.insets, 2,2,2,2. Gridbag constraints 21.anchor equals java.awt.gridbagconstraints.west. Gridbag constraints 21.fill equals java.awt.gridbagconstraints.horizontal. Gridbag constraints 21.weights equals 0.5d. Gridbag constraints 31.gridx equals 1. Gridbag constraints 31.grid equals 1. Gridbag constraints 31.weights equals 0.5d. Gridbag constraints 31.fill equals java.awt.gridbagconstraints.horizontal. Gridbag constraints 31.insets equals new java.awt.insets, 2,2,2,2. Gridbag constraints 31.anchor equals java.awt.gridbagconstraints.west. Gridbag constraints 31.appendx equals 50. Gridbag constraints 42.gridx equals 0. Gridbag constraints 42.grid equals 2. Gridbag constraints 42.insets equals new java.awt.insets, 2,2,2,2. Gridbag constraints 42.fill equals java.awt.gridbagconstraints.horizontal. Gridbag constraints 42.weights equals 0.5d. Gridbag constraints 42.anchor equals java.awt.gridbagconstraints.west. Gridbag constraints 52.gridx equals 1. Gridbag constraints 52.grid equals 2. Gridbag constraints 52.weights equals 0.5d. Gridbag constraints 52.fill equals java.awt.gridbagconstraints.horizontal. Grid bag constraints 52.insets equals new java.awt.insets, 2,2,2,2. Grid bag constraints 52.anchor equals java.awt.gridbagconstraints.west. Grid bag constraints 52.apadx equals 50. Grid bag constraints 62.gridx equals 0. Grid bag constraints 62.grid equals 3. Grid bag constraints 62.insets equals new java.awt.insets, 2,2,2,2. Grid bag constraints 62.anchor equals java.awt.gridbagconstraints.west. Grid bag constraints 62.fill equals java.awt.gridbagconstraints.horizontal. Grid bag constraints 62.weights equals 0.5d. Grid bag constraints 72.gridx equals 1. Grid bag constraints 72.grid equals 3. Grid bag constraints 72.weights equals 0.5d. Grid bag constraints 72.fill equals java.awt.gridbagconstraints.horizontal. Grid bag constraints 72.insets equals new java.awt.insets, 2,2,2,2. Grid bag constraints 72.anchor equals java.awt.gridbagconstraints.west. Grid bag constraints 72.apadx equals 50. Panel proxy auth.add, getch proxicane auth, grid bag constraints 16. Panel proxy auth.add, JLabel 9, grid bag constraints 21. Panel proxy auth.add, getst proxicane realm, grid bag constraints 31. Panel proxy auth.add, JLabel 10, grid bag constraints 42. Panel proxy auth.add, getst proxicane username, grid bag constraints 52. Panel proxy auth.add, JLabel 11, grid bag constraints 62. Panel proxy auth.add, getst proxicane password, grid bag constraints 72. Return panel proxy auth. This method initializes jscrollpane. At return javax.swing.jscrollpane. Private jscrollpane get jscrollpane. If jscrollpane equals null. JScrollPane equals new JScrollPane. JScrollPane.set viewport view, getst proxicane skip name. JScrollPane.horizontal scrollbar policy, javax.swing.jscrollpane.horizontal_scrollbar_never. Return JScrollPane. This method initializes panel proxicane. At return javax.swing.jpanel. Private jpanel get panel proxicane. If panel proxicane equals null. Panel proxicane equals new jpanel. Java.awt.gridbagconstraints gridbagconstraints 82 equals new gridbagconstraints. Java.awt.gridbagconstraints gridbagconstraints 92 equals new gridbagconstraints. Javax.swing.jlabel jlabel 8 equals new jlabel. Java.awt.gridbagconstraints gridbagconstraints 102 equals new gridbagconstraints. Panel proxicane.set layout, new gridbag layout. Gridbag constraints 82.gridx equals 0. Gridbag constraints 82.grid equals 0. Gridbag constraints 82.insets equals new java.awt.insets, 2,2,2,2. Gridbag constraints 82.anchor equals java.awt.gridbagconstraints.northwest. Gridbag constraints 82.fill equals java.awt.gridbagconstraints.horizontal. Gridbag constraints 82.weights equals 1.0d. Gridbag constraints 92.gridx equals 0. Gridbag constraints 92.grid equals 1. Gridbag constraints 92.insets equals new java.awt.insets, 2,2,2,2. Gridbag constraints 92.anchor equals java.awt.gridbagconstraints.northwest. Gridbag constraints 92.fill equals java.awt.gridbagconstraints.horizontal. Panel proxicane.set name, proxy chain. JLabel 8.set text. Grid bag constraints 102.anchor equals java.awt.gridbagconstraints.northwest. Grid bag constraints 102.fill equals java.awt.gridbagconstraints.both. Grid bag constraints 102.gridx equals 0. Grid bag constraints 102.grid equals 2. Grid bag constraints 102.weights equals 1.0d. Grid bag constraints 102.weighty equals 1.0d. Panel proxicane.add, get jpanel, grid bag constraints 82. Panel proxicane.add, get panel proxyauth, grid bag constraints 92. Panel proxicane.add, JLabel 8, grid bag constraints 102. Return panel proxicane. This method initializes text proxicane at return javax.swing.jtext field. Private jtext field gets proxicane. If text proxicane equals null. Text proxicane equals new jtext field. Return text proxicane. This method initializes text proxicane port at return javax.swing.jtext field. Private jtext field gets proxicane port. If text proxicane port equals null. Text proxicane port equals new jtext field. Return text proxicane port. This method initializes text proxicane skip name at return javax.swing.jtext area. Private jtext area gets proxicane skip name. If text proxicane skip name equals null. Text proxicane skip name equals new jtext area. Text proxicane skip name set font, new java.awt.font, dialog, java.awt.font.plain, 11. Text proxicane skip name set minimum size, new java.awt.dimension, 032. Text proxicane skip name set rows, 2. Return text proxicane skip name. This method initializes this at return void. Private void initialize. This set layout, new card layout. This set name, connection. This add, get panel proxicane, get name. Public void init param, object obj. Options param equals, options param, obj. Connection param equals options param get connection param. Set proxy chain parameters. If connection param get proxicane equals shqs proxicane set selected, false. Set proxicane enabled, false. Else shqs proxicane set selected, true. Set proxicane enabled, true. Text proxicane set text, connection param get proxicane. Text proxicane port set text, integer toString, connection param get proxicane port. Text proxicane skip name set text, connection param get proxicane skip name. If connection param get proxicane username equals proxicane auth set selected, false. Set proxicane auth enabled, false. Else proxicane auth set selected, true. Set proxicane auth enabled, true. Text proxicane realm set text, connection param get proxicane realm. Text proxicane username set text, connection param get proxicane username. Text proxicane password set text, connection param get proxicane password. Private void set proxicane enabled, boolean is enabled. Text proxicane set enabled, is enabled. Text proxicane port set enabled, is enabled. Text proxicane skip name set enabled, is enabled. Proxicane auth set enabled, is enabled. Color equals color.white. If is enabled. Text proxicane set text. Text proxicane port set text. Text proxicane skip name set text. Proxicane auth set selected, false. Set proxicane auth enabled, false. Color equals panel proxicane get background. test.proxycaname.set background, color. test.proxycaneport.set background, color. test.proxycaneskipname.set background, color. Private void set proxycanauth enabled, boolean is enabled. test.proxycanerealm.set enabled, is enabled. test.proxycaneusername.set enabled, is enabled. test.proxycanepassword.set enabled, is enabled. Color equals color.white. If, is enabled. test.proxycanerealm.set text. test.proxycaneusername.set text. test.proxycanepassword.set text. Color equals panel proxycane.get background. test.proxycanerealm.set background, color. test.proxycaneusername.set background, color. test.proxycanepassword.set background, color. Public void validate param, object obj, throws exception. Int proxycane port equals 8080. If, shqs proxycane is selected. Try. Proxycane port equals integer.parseInt, test.proxycane port.get text. Catch, number format exception env. test.proxycane port.request focus. Throw new exception, invalid proxy chain port number. Public void save param, object obj, throws exception. Options param equals, options param, obj. Connection param equals options param.get connection param. Int proxycane port equals 8080. If, shqs proxycane is selected. Try. Proxycane port equals integer.parseInt, test.proxycane port.get text. Catch, number format exception env. test.proxycane port.request focus. Throw new exception, invalid proxy chain port number. Connection param.set proxycaname, test.proxycaname.get text. Connection param.set proxycane port, proxycane port. Connection param.set proxycane skip name, test.proxycane skip name.get text. Connection param.set proxycane realm, test.proxycane realm.get text. Connection param.set proxycane username, test.proxycane username.get text. Connection param.set proxycane password, test.proxycane password.get text. This method initializes test.proxycane realm. At return javax.swing.jtext field. Private jtext field gets proxycane realm. If, test.proxycane realm equals null. test.proxycane realm equals new jtext field. Return test.proxycane realm. This method initializes test.proxycane username. At return javax.swing.jtext field. Private jtext field gets proxycane username. If, test.proxycane username equals null. test.proxycane username equals new jtext field. Return test.proxycane username. This method initializes test.proxycane password. At return javax.swing.jtext field. Private jtext field gets proxycane password. If, test.proxycane password equals null. test.proxycane password equals new jtext field. Return test.proxycane password. This method initializes proxycaneauth. At return javax.swing.jcheckbox. Private jcheckbox gets proxycaneauth. If, proxycaneauth equals null. proxycaneauth equals new jcheckbox. proxycaneauth.set text, outgoing proxy server requires authentication. proxycaneauth.add action listener, new java.awt.event.action listener. Public void action performed, java.awt.event.action event e. Set proxycaneauth enabled, proxycaneauth. Is selected. Return proxycaneauth. At javdecl index equals 0 visual constraint equals 10,10. Package org.paros proxy.paros.view. Import java.awt.frame. Import java.awt.headless exception. Import org.paros proxy.paros.model.options param. To change the template for this generated type comment, go to Window, Preferences, Java, Code Generation, Code and Comments. Public class options dialog extends abstract param dialog. Private static final string root equals private options param equals null. Public options dialog. Super. Initialize. At param parent. At param modal. At param title. At throws headless exception. Public options dialog, frame parent, boolean modal, string title. Throws headless exception. Super, parent, modal, title, options. Initialize. This method initializes this. At return void. Private void initialize. This dot set size, 600, 450. At javedict index equals 0 visual constraint equals 10,10.